Hi, and welcome back to ConTinual. And tonight on the panel room, we're going to be rearranging the deck chairs and hitting the beach. We're all climbing aboard the cruise ship to go see what kind of murder, mayhem, and romance we can find on the high seas. So let's see who is all coming along and coming aboard. So, Frank, you're up first.
Hi, my name is Frank W. Butterfield, and I'm the author of 93 novels, short stories, and novellas that are all set in the same universe. I write gay mystery primarily, with romance and adventure kind of thrown in, and some spy stuff. And I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Marlena?
Hi, my name is Marlena Frank. I'm a young adult fantasy and horror author. I've written everything from short stories to novels to book series, so kind of the whole gambit.
JL.
I am JL Gribble. I am a sci-fi fantasy, urban fantasy, spec fic author, primarily novels, but I'm currently dipping my toe into queer paranormal romance.
Miski?
Hi, I'm Miski Harris. I primarily write romance with a side of fiction, always drama. I've actually done a couple of shorts. I tried cozy, it didn't work. And paranormal.
All right.
Hi, I'm Ari McKay, and with my writing partner, Rachel Langella, we write contemporary and action-adventure romances. Ari McKay, and as Rachel Langella, we write urban fantasy and paranormal romance.
Glenn.
Hey, I'm Glenn Parris. I write science fiction. I write fantasy. I write vampire science fiction, some historical fiction, and I've written one story for Marvel, and I'm working on another one.
And tonight we get a first-time boarding passenger in RJ.
Hi, I'm RJ Peterson, and I write contemporary romance, usually with older guys, and lately on cruises.
So, since we'll start there, that's what we're here to talk about, is how do you set your story on a cruise ship, and why would you? So, Frank, let's actually kind of start with this. What is it about the idea of a cruise ship that kind of appeals to you? I mean, when we look at a cruise ship, it's kind of, that setting of a small town at sea with a bunch of people that don't necessarily know each other, at least at the beginning.
So the first thing I have to do is I have to make a confession. I have never been on a cruise, and I don't think I ever will, because I get seasick and I get really badly seasick. But I do write historical fiction, so I've never been to most of the places that I write about because they don't exist anymore, because 1957 Parris doesn't exist. So the appeal that I had with writing the book that I wrote that is set on a cruise ship was that I wanted a locked room mystery. And a cruise ship is the perfect one because you can't get on, you can't get off. Particularly in the one that I wrote, which was in 1954. There was no helicopters coming to the cruise ship, or like people coming up on speedboats or other yachts docking or whatever. It was just the ship going from San Francisco to Honolulu, and while they were in the middle of the ocean, there was nobody who could get on or get off, theoretically. So that was the appeal. But then when I started writing about it, then I had this thought of like, maybe I actually do want to do this. Maybe I do want to go on a cruise. But then I'm like, but 1950s cruising isn't available now. So that was like, okay, well, anyway. But no, writing the story with, like you say, the small town, and the characters have the ability to get to know new people in ways and in environs that normally wouldn't happen because they're so in the same space. The ship that I wrote about, I think, had 500 passengers or 450. So I think that's small compared to today's cruising. And there was also, because of the ship that it was the SS Lurleen, which was one of the best ships for crossing the Pacific. There were movie stars, and so I threw in a couple, and which is start off a whole bunch of other things that I wasn't expecting, but that was the beginning of several new relationships that have gone through several books. But that was what it came from, was I wanted to do a locked room mystery, and I was like, well, the perfect place to do that would be a cruise ship. So that's how I got there.
Marlena, how about you? What was the great inspiration for pulling in cruise ships?
Well, I think cruises offer a very unique way of isolating people. Something about being out on the open ocean in the middle of the night, and especially for some cruises where you go down really long hallways and you don't see people for a long time. For horror, especially, I think it's a very unique opportunity there. To have a dichotomy between the fun and enjoyment that there is to have on a cruise, but also flip that into the isolation and the potential horror of it. So.
JL?
So I took a 2-week transatlantic cruise from Orlando to Barcelona. And it was when I was writing my alternate history fantasy series where tech is severely limited. And that was how I kind of came up with the idea of, well, if airplanes don't exist and tech is limited to a lot of what Frank's probably writing, like luxury cruise ships, how are people people and especially luxury goods going to get transported overseas? And so when my characters needed to go from North America to Europe, I stuck them on a cruise ship. And I'm actually rewriting certain parts of that book from a different character's perspective now to launch my new series. So it's been a lot of fun revisiting that, especially because I'm going to be on a cruise ship in 2 weeks. So I'm getting really excited.
Miski, how about you?
My story, my cruise ship story is actually called Cruise. The first main character's last name is Cruz with a Z. I got inspired by this because I was trolling through the internet looking at cruises, and I hit upon one that left on my birthday. And as much as I tried, they wouldn't let me buy a ticket because it was 2,000 gay men. And unless I was willing to prove it, I couldn't go. I couldn't see a problem, but they could. So I thought, what a great place to establish a relationship that has to live through something dramatic. Because remember, I always have to have drama. So my story actually goes before the cruise, during the cruise, after the cruise, including all the stops. I had a lot of fun with it. Cruises take you to some very romantic places, and the mind can really, really wander. We went to Pompeii and Santorini, Chios Beach Club. And then, of course, in the end, somebody had to get kidnapped. Somebody had to, get killed, because that's just Miski. But they lived happily ever after.
Except for the ones that died.
Yeah, well, if you're going to be in a Miski book, you have to roll the dice. That's just how it is.
So Ari, how about you? What inspired you to set a setting on a cruise?
Well, first, I love cruises, and I've been cruising since I was in my 20s, and I've been, just about everywhere in the Caribbean, and I grew up in Miami, so of course cruising was a big thing because Miami is a huge port. And so I'm also very, very interested in not just the whole aspect of cruising, that it's romantic and you go to exotic places, but I'm an engineer by trade. And so I was very, very excited to get to look at like the behind the scenes stuff with cruises. So actually one of the main characters in my book, Seeking Solace, is actually an employee. He's a bartender on the cruise. And his romantic interest is an executive from the cruise line who is taking his first cruise as, somebody who's going to be running the cruise line. And so it was really interesting to get to, because everybody does know the palm trees and the romantic nights and the big moon and everything. But I got to show like the behind the scenes parts of cruising. And that was just really interesting to me.
Glenn?
Well, I've not written a story yet about a cruise, but for my birthday in April, I'm actually going on a writer's cruise to the Western Caribbean. So I've already booked passage. Sorry, Miski, I got it. But I thought it would be cool to write a story on a cruise ship. Cruise ship is a lot like an island with a built-in time bomb on it. You know, you have a certain amount of time until it reaches port, and until then, you're kind of stuck. It's the other thing about a cruise is there are limited places to hide. If someone really does a search, you know, they'll find you on a ship. You know, even if you're a stowaway. But what if you can't find somebody, but they keep reappearing? That would be a really cool story. And I can't swim. That's the other thing. I've been on a number of cruises, and it's a little nerve-wracking for me because I swim like a rock. You know, I think about it. If anything happens, I'm done. There's some people can paddle around for a while. I can't. I go right down. So that's another level of anxiety that I deal with cruise ships. And that the other thing is, you know, there are always these people that you just can't get away from. It'd be fun to write about a cruise where you try to find all kinds of hiding places, and there's one pesky person keeps finding you and doesn't give you any peace. You can have all kinds of fun with a cruise story.
That sounds like a romance to me.
Yeah.
RJ, how about you?
Well, unlike Frank, who has never been on a cruise before, I've been cruising since 1992. My husband and I just got off our 56th cruise last week. So for me, when I finally thought about writing, to me, setting it on a cruise ship just made sense because I've done a whole lot of them and I really love them. And again, the whole romance aspect, because I'm writing low angst, sweet with heat romances, it made sense to set it on a cruise ship and to have two guys. Actually, my first book, two guys meet in Barcelona just before a cruise and end up falling in love on that cruise. So to me, it's a perfect setting for something like that.
So let's start talking about how you go and approach, you know, the setup for working on a cruise ship, because again, you're kind of working in that it's got certain aspects of being a small town, because at least for a period of time, you're all packed there together and everybody's going to kind of have an idea what everybody's doing, but you also don't necessarily know each other. So it's almost that pack of strangers.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a lot of fun stuff to deal with. So Marlena, when you were going through, what were the biggest elements that you had fun with, and you know, how did you approach working with the cruise and working kind of with that modality? What were the things that really were important and made a difference in how you told the story?
So this is currently a work in progress piece that I'm working on. But one of the things that I did was I'm writing a creature feature, you know, horror novel that's going to be set on the cruise ship. And basically, one of the things I wanted to keep track of was all the information they give in your muster station review, things like that, because all of that can be useful if something, you know, if there's an emergency on the ship, you know, there's different blasts, different tones that are used based on whatever the emergency is. So that sort of thing was really useful for me to kind of get an idea of. I also went through and tried to draw like a sketch out of general layouts, because you usually have one or two floors on a cruise ship where most of the people tend to go to hang out. That's usually like a pool area, bar area, that sort of thing. So that's obviously a big center point of, you know, most novels is going to have a scene there at some point that's on a cruise ship, you know, so at least if it's a modern day cruise ship. So I really wanted to kind of sketch out what that would be like. And because we get to make up our own cruise ships sometimes, you know, I can pull pieces of different cruise ships that I like or can be useful for the novels that I'm writing. So,
JL, how about you? What were kind of the elements that you wanted to play with that were unique to working in the locale of a cruise ship?
I really like to torture my characters. So the funniest thing I could think of to do to an earth mage is stick him in the middle of the ocean on a boat. And then, of course, the romantic interest is there and is like using magic will help them through it. But the other person who's with them is the person that the earth mage is kind of like psychically connected to. And that's when they find out that like a boat is not big enough for them to get away from each other. So I had a lot of fun playing with just the constraints of how big a ship is and what you're limited to. And just like, yeah, you can't go anywhere, especially for transatlantic cruises. Because when I took my transatlantic cruise, I'll never forget when I was poking around in the little library that they have on some Royal Caribbean ships. And we were like 4 or 5 days in, and this gentleman comes into the library and he wants to know where that day's Wall Street Journal is and where he can get that. And the staff member very politely was like, we don't have that, sir. And we held it together until that guy left, and then we about died laughing. So it's just fun to play with the limiting factors of a floating island.
Mm-hmm.
So, Miski, how about you? What were some of the elements that you came and played with? And then tell me, how many of those dead people happened to go overboard? I got to know.
Well, okay, so the dead person didn't die on ship.
How did I guess?
This is a story of two men from two totally different backgrounds. Like Ron, my characters tend to be older because I think everybody writes the young twinks that have it all. And so one main character is an author and an architect. Strange combination, I know. But
Writers.
what I like about a cruise is you have a limited amount of days. So you either have a great attraction or you keep it moving. And that gets me out of trouble with the insta love that I seem to like. I literally followed this cruise that I found. Every port, they had adventures at each of these ports. But there's a stalker. And so at the end of the cruise is where actually it's the mother that shoots our stalker. I like writers like Agatha Christie, and I like stories like, Murder on the Orient Express, places where I think it was Frank that said, you're in a locked room. You got nowhere to go. So for the romance part, you got nowhere to go. You either find love or it's a long boat ride. It's that simple and that difficult. I also had that one traveler that you just couldn't get away from. His name was Danny. Danny has a really interesting story in the end of it all, but damn was he a pain in the ass. Oops. Sorry.
Not the F-bomb, so it's cool.
Yeah, it wasn't F-bomb, so I'm good, right? Yep. He was a real pain sometimes because, like I said, we're on a cruise. We ain't got a lot of time. We're trying to develop this relationship, and you need to go away. So that's why I picked it. That's why I enjoyed it.
So Ari, how about you? What are kind of those deeper elements of telling the story in the locked room?
Well, for me, part of it was having a character who was one of the employees who, he had access to different parts of the ship. And so he was taking his love interest to all these different places that the general public didn't get to see. So that was kind of interesting too. And one aspect of the story is that they fall in love. Yes, I did do the insta love thing, but they don't know each other. And, they don't really have any way to do research about each other. So there's a very hidden aspect to one of the characters that he doesn't reveal to this person. And the person who works on the ship, when he finds this out, is devastated because he had no idea that this person wasn't exactly who they were portraying themselves to be. So that does, feed into the locked room thing. I mean, if you can't get out and do research about, you can't go out and just Google somebody and find out who they actually are, that, you just have to kind of take them at face value, which may or may not be a good thing.
Glenn?
Yeah, so everything is cool on a cruise until it stalls. When the ship stops moving, and you realize that you can't see land, 360-degree turn, all of a sudden it's like, okay, how long can we stay out here? How much food do we have? How much fresh water do we have? Do we have enough electricity? Do we have enough energy? So those are some of the elements that can kind of ramp up a cruise. And then what if you find out that, more than half the passengers are actually going to be the meals? And everybody's real happy. And they're very cordial, get to know you, where you're from. And then, the dinner bell rings. It's like, oh, by the way, your dinner, run. That's something that you can't do on land. And you can kind of do it on a desert island, but it's kind of not the same thing. There's a time limit on a ship.
RJ, how about you? What are the kind of the deeper big elements that you really make the difference in playing with a cruise ship versus other circumstances?
Well, when I wrote my first book, which is Love on the Horizon, I had an older guy who was in fact a widower, and his husband passed away 2 years earlier, and they used to travel together a lot. And he hasn't traveled since his husband died. So this is his first foray back into traveling again. And he's a little apprehensive because he's uncomfortable doing this alone, but a good friend of his convinces him that he has to do this. And then he meets this guy at a hotel bar in Barcelona, finds out he's on the same 7-day cruise. And they're in Europe. They're doing a 7-night round trip cruise to Barcelona. So I got to play with a couple of days at sea, but also some port days. So it gave me some places for them to go and get to know each other, because it wasn't quite insta love, but they felt an attraction pretty early on. And I really enjoyed creating my own cruise ship based on some favorites from a few different cruise lines. And for me, never having written before, to sit down and actually say, okay, I need to design this cruise ship. What kinds of public rooms am I going to have? Where can I have them do various things? That was a whole lot of fun. And then to actually be able to think back to shore excursions that I've taken and use those and put those two people kind of discovering a new place as a way to get to know each other a little bit better was also a really fun thing to do.
Frank, how about you?
Well, the thing that I used actually to start everything off was the captain's table for the first night. And because the main characters were a male couple, they were out, so ahistorically 20-something years before Harvey Milk. And so they were known, and the captain is trying to figure out exactly what to do, because they're also the wealthiest people on the boat, and he can't just keep them in their room. So there also happens to be a lesbian couple. traveling. And so the captain's like, oh, well, let's put them together because that just makes sense. Or let's put them in the same part of the table together. And that doesn't go well at all. And there's a lot of like people huffing and puffing at the table and being, and that event triggers a whole bunch of other things. It's the reason why the murder ends up occurring. And anyway, so it was that. And then also the fact that, like I said before, because of the ship, the Lurleen, it almost always, particularly in the summer, had Hollywood people going back and forth to Hawaii on it. And whether they were coming from LA or from San Francisco. And in this particular instance, I put Rosalind Russell and her husband, Freddie Brisson, on the cruise, along with Barbara Hale, pre-Perry Mason. This is a couple of years before they started filming Perry Mason. And those two end up being part of like helping to solve the mystery. They're like running around the ship, like helping Nick, who's the main character, who's the private detective millionaire, do all sorts of things. And so being able to do that, but I always do this. There's always somebody in one of my books, particularly the stuff in the 50s and 60s, where I have an opinion that I want to share that nobody else would really care about. And that is another movie person, TV person, was Gail Storm, was on this ship along with her husband. And I hate with a purple passion Gail Storm. She was not a very nice person, apparently. And she played really sweet, bubbly characters, but apparently was not like that at all. I also am not a big fan of her politics. And anyway, so I got to like get everybody else to agree that we don't like Gail Storm on this cruise. That was fun. Poor Gail. But anyway, and if you don't know who she is, there's a reason. So don't feel bad if you don't know who I'm talking about. But anyway, so it was that like who is going to be on the ship was part of what actually set up the mystery itself. What set up the murder, what set up the actual solving of the crime was because of like because of what the ship was and who would be sailing, who would be on there. And in fact, it turns out that the murderer is not somebody who would normally be on this ship. And that's kind of what makes it not so much easy to solve, but they kind of stand out in a way that no one is expecting. So, and one other thing I forgot, because it's 1954, this was very helpful. There are big, huge trunks that people carry. Well, they don't carry them, but are carried for them. And you know what? You can do lots of things with big, huge trunks that you can't do with just like suitcases. You can like put bodies in them. You can like put murder weapons. You can like slit open like the lining and stuff things in there, which I've done. It's those big trunks. We really should bring them back, except for the pack where there just aren't people standing around waiting to carry your luggage anymore. But anyway, so those are the things I used.
I don't know that those will go through the X-ray machines. We can give it a try.
No. They would need their like X-ray room instead of a machine.
So didn't they used to call them steamers?
Yeah, well, yeah, but by the 50s they weren't calling them that anymore. They just called them trunks. But yes, no, steamers goes back to because they were used for steamer ships, steamships.
I'm old. What can I say?
So, one of the fun aspects to kind of playing with this idea is your characters, because I mean, normally when we're writing stories, we've got to find a way to kind of put them into the unusual situation. Because normally they're at work, they're at home, they're living their lives, and when things go amiss or go awry or when everything happens. In this case, ostensibly, everybody is, unless, of course, they're working for the cruise ship, they're going on vacation. They're out, they're trying to have fun. They're in an entirely different space, hopefully, than normally what they're doing. So how does this change up your characters, especially if they're part of a normal standard series or something like that? But how do you approach characters that ostensibly are out to go have a little fun? So, JL?
So my characters were not planning to go on this adventure. They had to get out of the city and get as far away as possible. And so they end up on essentially a luxury cruise ship, staying in the owner's suite with all of the perks that entails. But they have like no appropriate clothing. So they're at the owner's table in the dining room wearing, the jeans and t-shirts that they packed for their trip. And everyone, of course, is all huffy at them because they don't look like they belong. So what are they going to do? They're just going to drink all the free cocktails because they have all the owner's privileges. And it was a lot of fun to basically like take the things like the expectations that I have about cruise ships. Like one of the things I love is that like dressing for dinner, like we don't do that in real life anymore. And so it was fun to like have that be an element of the story that was expected, but then my characters couldn't do that. And how are they going to deal with that?
Miski, how about you? How does this change up how you approach the characters, how you approach the story?
Well, usually, I don't have as many books written as everybody else. So, Cruise was a vacation from my Don't Ask, Don't Tell series. And it started with a funeral. Armando, one of my main characters, was his wife died. And the cruise is a year after. So, and it's like you said, he wasn't planning on going on this cruise. To make a long story short, his wife bought the tickets. She knew she was dying. She bought the ticket and made him promise to go. Lyndon also wasn't planning on going on this cruise, but he's a workaholic. If he's not designing buildings, he's writing. So his mother and sister teamed up to get him on this cruise, so that maybe he would exercise something other than his brain. I like that approach because that means that neither man came on the, normally when you are going to go on a cruise, and I guess, Ron, you can help me with this, but you've already figured out what you want to do and you've got things kind of planned out. But these are two men who were blindsided.
Mm-hmm.
And they just happened to meet on this cruise. I made a lot of my story at the ports because that's how I developed the relationship between them. Exploring each other as they explored Pompeii. There was there's a bay that goes into underground caverns, that kind of thing. So I literally had the itinerary for this cruise taped to my wall as I wrote. And I think that's what gave it a lot of depth. I included Danny because you need a character. And I was dealing with a lot of type subjects. Armando's family was very religious and homophobic. He'd been in the closet all his life. Lyndon wasn't in the closet, but he had a crazy ex-boyfriend who stalked them while on this cruise. That it was him doesn't come out till the end. So that's how I made it a story, not just a story about get on a boat, make love, get off the boat, and now we're inseparable. I wanted there to be an aspect of believability, like this could happen.
Yeah, you had to ranch up the drama. We know there's got to be the drama. So,
you picking on me, Jim?
So Ari, yours is a little bit different here because you're working with people or working with characters that are working on a cruise ship that are full of people that are ostensibly on vacation. So how does that change up for you, kind of how you approach the story?
Well, there was an aspect to it that's different because Devin, who was the bartender on the ship, or one of the bartenders on the ship, bartending is a very kind of extroverted profession, and he interacts with the passengers constantly. I mean, that's his job, right? So he's very fun loving, and definitely that's part of the aspect of the job that he really liked, was, dealing with the people every day. And Paul, who is the cruise line executive, is much more repressed, very workaholic. And he comes on in, who JL was talking about, her characters only had jeans. Well, Paul comes on the ship with only suits. He doesn't come on with a single pair of shorts or a bathing suit or anything like that, because he's working. So, and he doesn't see this as a vacation. This is part of my job. I'm supposed to learn this stuff. And so part of the aspect of that was getting Devin actually, one of the bonding moments is Devin loans him his favorite t-shirt. And because he brought no t-shirts or anything to wear. And he's like, no, you cannot go into port in a business suit. I absolutely refuse to let you go into port in a suit. And so that was an interesting aspect of it there. It's like, because wardrobe matters. I mean, JL found that out, right? Wardrobe matters. So, this was something it created a good bonding kind of experience, because like, who in the heck goes on a cruise ship without clothes that you can wear on a cruise ship? So that was really, really fun to play with.
Glenn, how about you? What's your thoughts around kind of how does this change up how your characters would interact and what it means for them?
Well, as we've been talking, I've been formulating an idea for a short story on a cruise ship. And, as I listen, I'm thinking, okay, what can I do differently? So I thought about using the food on a cruise ship as a character. So, when you go on a cruise, the food is always great. And there's just tons and tons of it. You get on a cruise weighing 180 pounds, you get off the cruise weighing 240 pounds. So
I was going to say, I haven't seen 180 in a long time.
I remember high school. But, what if the food on a cruise ship tastes perfectly fine to everybody but the main character? And he gets no satisfaction from any of the food. And then, he starts interacting with the food that he's eating. So I've got an idea for a story on that, along those lines. I'll let you know after my April cruise.
Hopefully, you're not the main course.
Yeah, no, I'll try to avoid that.
That was my first thought.
RJ, how about you? How does the fact of this kind of really change up things for you? How do you approach the story a little differently?
I think I did it in my latest book, which isn't out yet, but will be soon. I have my original two couples from my first book. They end up getting married at the beginning of the fourth book, and they're fairly well off. So they bring a bunch of family and close friends with them on their honeymoon to have a continual party, and they're doing a 2-week Mediterranean cruise. And the two guys who are the two main characters who end up falling in love on this one, neither one of them have been on a cruise before. So they determine early on that since they're the cruise virgins, they're going to stick together and try to help each other out, trying to figure out what to do on the ship, where to go, how to maneuver, 16 or 17 decks and all of that. And that gave me a new way of looking at a cruise ship from like a newbie's eyes, and created a nice bond between the two of them and helped them determine that there was something more going on between the two of them.
Frank, how about you? How did the fact of you've got a lot of people that are supposedly on vacation and traveling and all this, did that really change up how you approach the story and the characters?
No, not really, because my characters were also not expecting to go. The reason why they went was because Nick's stepsister got married, and they gave her as part of their wedding gift was to give them this cruise and also a stay at the Pink Palace on Waikiki. And then right as she's catching the bouquet, she falls and breaks her ankle. And so her mother, which is Nick's stepmother, because they're anyway, insists that Nick and Carter need to take a vacation because they literally 10 days earlier had just gotten out of jail, and they need to like get the hell out of town and blah blah blah. So it turns out to be a working trip. They don't ever have a vacation because like literally from the captain's table that night all the way through till they get to Honolulu, they're working. So they end up, as a side note, going to Kauai, and Carter ends up buying a house there, which is this whole other thing that ends up happening that plays out over several books, right above where Princeville was built. But Princeville isn't there yet. So it's like in the middle of literally nowhere. And then they finally have a vacation when they're on the middle of nowhere, like right on the edge of the ocean, and there's nobody around to like be killed or anything. Then suddenly everything works out really well. But yeah, no, the fact that everybody, and the other thing that's interesting is, I hadn't thought of it this way, but the truth is nobody on this cruise is actually on vacation, because Barbara Hale has her own agenda. Gail Storm, God bless her, has her own agenda. And Rosalind Russell is like they're on a cruise because it's like the only way they can get away from what they're doing in their real life. They're trying to be on vacation, but again, they end up working because they end up like, monitoring the halls to see if the murderer is found and that sort of thing. So literally no one's on vacation at all. There are other people around who are vacationing, but we don't really get to know them. So, but I hadn't thought of that till you asked the question.
Marlena, how about you? Does the idea that people are on vacation play into it, and the fact that, if you're bringing a little existential dread to vacation?
Absolutely. So with my story, it's going to be two young women, college students, able to go out on a cruise on their own. But, people do some rather foolish stuff on cruises, and there's going to be some strife that's going to happen with that. But, sometimes having, monsters or whatever it is that you're dealing with, having an external stressor can actually help people resolve a lot of issues sometimes like that in a relationship. When you're trying to help each other out, you're trying to survive, and suddenly things are a bit bigger than, someone being ridiculous on a cruise ship and, flirting with the wrong people, or, getting a little too drunk and doing things they probably shouldn't have, that sort of thing. So it's, and plus whenever you're going on a cruise, you're packing to have a good time. You're packing like your swimsuits if it's down in the warmer climates, and you're not really planning on having to, even if you have the skill set to attack things, and you're not really bringing any kind of weapons or anything like that. You can't, and you shouldn't. But like, so even if you're in that situation and normally you might be prepared for it, on a cruise ship, no, you're not going to have anything that you might normally have access to for that.
So one of the other kind of fun aspects of working with the cruise ship as a setup, and we've talked about it some already, is the fact that you're going to be popping between different ports. So everybody's getting to go to different locales, but you really don't have a whole lot of control over where you go. So Miski, since you kind of started with it a while ago, as we play with this idea of going from port to port, how much can you play with the idea of the excursions or the ports or the different places you're going? How do you play with that into the story and potentially not have somebody run off or die on the beach? I know that's impossible for you. It's okay. But how does the idea of going to different excursions, going to different ports, different things like that, how much does that change up how you approach the story versus somebody is going to different locales and working their way through an adventure? Now you kind of know you're in a canned adventure and your options become a little more limited, maybe. So how does that get to play for you?
Actually, it made it essential to the development of the relationship between Armando and Lyndon. I did have things that happened aboard ship, but I didn't want it to turn into the Love Boat, where everything just magically happens in this one room. So I had in my chapters, I had the whole issues of getting off the boat, getting back on time, built into the time they had together. So, for instance, in Pompeii, actually in most of it, remember Lyndon is an architect and a workaholic. So I talked about how drawn in he was by the architecture of Greece, the caves, the grottos. When you include the side visits, I think it just makes your story, well, for me, it made it more well-rounded, especially since I've never been on a cruise. And I didn't let that interfere with my fun in writing the story. I played with the idea of my stalker doing something crazy in Greece, but I didn't want to interrupt the development of their relationship. I needed that relationship at the end. So it's actually like his story, and their story is how I wrote it.
So I think you and Frank need to take a trip together. Just
I'll cross the river or something, but that's fine.
Frank, I'm a nurse. I'll bring Dramamine. You'll be fine.
Well, I've done Dramamine and it knocks me out. It's like
I said, you'll be fine.
It'll cure everything.
Behind your ear, you'll be fine.
Ari, how about you? So with the ports, and especially again, kind of playing with that idea that these are folks working for the cruise line, how did the different ports, the different stops, were you able to use that in pushing the story along?
Oh, absolutely. Because, one of the aspects, I mean, a lot of the crew, they do get time off in port. And so I had it where, Paul was not going to get off the ship. He figured he would spend port days just doing paperwork or whatever. But Devon's like, no, you cannot work for this cruise line and not go to the ports. How can you say that you understand cruising if you've never gotten off the ship? You have to see the ports, you have to see the people, and you have to learn what the appeal is of these things. So Devon gets Paul off the ship and he takes him to his favorite little out of the way place in Grand Cayman to get local food, and takes him to a straw market, and all through the islands he's making him see how every island is different. Every island has its own kind of rhythm and its own kind of feel, and that was giving Paul as a character a chance to develop the fact that he could see that the work wasn't exactly the only aspect of it. The money and the passengers and making sure that you have great service on the ship is not the only thing that people go for. That people do go for the ports. That it's the attraction of seeing these exotic places and going to experience these things that you can only experience on the individual islands. Every island has its own unique adventures that you can have. So that was very important to the story.
So Glenn, how about you? What's your thoughts on using ports of call and different things like that?
Again, the bunch of you are just really rich in ideas for stories. I mean, just talking to you guys, I'm stealing one of Frank's ideas, and I'm thinking about the Gabor sisters and North by Northwest. What if there's this star that everybody hates, and nobody knows that she's one of a group of triplets? And they kill this woman, and then at every port, one of the triplets gets on, and everybody thinks, okay, we did it, we got away with it, we murdered her, and then she comes out of the stateroom, and it's like, what the hell? And they kill her again. They go to the next port. The next thing you know, there she is coming out, in a chiffon dress and making a big grand entrance. It's like, what the F? And I didn't say
you talk about me killing people. He's killing triplets.
Wait, look, when I get going, I just heads roll.
Everybody dies.
So at the end of the story, everybody confesses because they figure they just can't kill this bitch.
Okay, Ron, you now have your new inspiration for the next love story.
Yeah.
So looking at the idea of excursions and kind of shifting up locales, what does that get to do for you?
I used it a lot in my latest book because, again, I've got these two cruise virgins who are now in the Mediterranean, going to places like Mykonos and Kusadasi in Turkey, where they go to Ephesus. And one of the main characters is a jewelry designer. And so he's always on the lookout for things that could inspire him to create the next big thing for him. And so he's sketching things that he sees, and he's taking photographs all over the place of different things. And the guy that he's falling for is hanging out with him and maybe seeing things from a whole new perspective, because Neil gets to look at some of this stuff through Matthew's eyes as he's sketching whatever. When they're walking somewhere and he sees, oh, I love that, let me just take a quick sketch. And Neil gets to experience this new port in a couple of different ways, one from Matthew's eyes and one just his own experiences. And that's one of the things I really love about cruising, is getting to see all of these different places, and it changes you as a person. So therefore it changes your characters too. They're better people for having experienced all of these different things.
So Frank, how have you been able to play with like ports of call or the different stops, things like that?
Well, there's nothing between San Francisco and Honolulu. So it doesn't, in fact, I was thinking about how a cruise like that, because at first I was going to say, well, cruises didn't do that. And then suddenly in my head, I could see all of these National Geographic ads for like, go all the way around South America and come, like for 120 days, where they're stopping literally everywhere. So I'm like, okay, yeah. If we go back to 1890, no, there weren't cruises like that, but by 1950s there were. But it also reminded me that this was kind of like taking. I'd actually written another story like this, and I hadn't thought of it. Taking the city of San Francisco from San Francisco to Chicago as a train that had only 5 or 6 stops because it was an express through the Rockies, which is kind of not really true, but it did go very fast when it could. And it was kind of like that. And the whole, like, not being able to get off anywhere and not being able to go see something has this way of kind of slowing things down. And when I was writing about that train trip, that was one of the things the characters kind of were dealing with, was like they had a lot of time on their hands. Because unlike a cruise ship where you could walk around and meet people, on a train you can only just go up and down the aisle and go from car to car. But they somehow or another, end up meeting people and having a good time and all that. But there's nowhere to get off on my ship. There's just one way, and then there's one stop, and then you're done.
Marlena, how about you? Did excursions, the stops, ports of call factor in?
Well, not necessarily for my story, but I was thinking about what Ron had said earlier about, stopping at ports and sketching and things. I have the luxury of traveling a lot with my sister, who's an artist, and that is something that she does all the time. At every port, pulls out her sketchbook and usually has a travel sketchbook, which she carries that around. And that way you've got, artwork that she's done of the places, her representation of those places. And that's a really cool thing you can work into characters. Another thing that I thought of was the joy of watching compilations of port runners, and how that was a thing that I didn't even know about until I think last year, where people are late for the ports of call getting back on the boat, and you'll see them running down the dock to try to get on the boat on time. And if they don't make it, the cruise, it's up to the captain. He'll leave them. They'll have to get a plane back, maybe meet them at the next destination or something. But wow, that can have a lot of impact in the story, definitely.
JL?
I'm just thinking of a cruise I went on with my husband. It stopped in Puerto Rico where my cousin happened to live at the time. And so we just ended up going and hanging out at her apartment. And we were watching TV, and we didn't realize how late it was. And so I think we were the second and third last on the boat, and the crew were actually really surprised that we weren't drunk, because most of those port runners are very drunk. So like Frank's, the cruise that I wrote was a one-way trip, though I'm sure my poor Earth mage would have been very happy to get off and take a break. But what was really fun was that in the original book, or the existing book, the destination, they knew they were going to get there. They didn't have a choice, but they knew that the family that was going to pick them up was going to help them go on their way. And so, yes, very pleasant. But in the spin-off book, where I'm rewriting passages from secondary characters' perspectives, the family that's picking them up is his ex-boyfriend's family. So he has a very, very different attitude about where they are going, and how well he will be received when they get there.
So I'm going to throw one last question out there, because we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still a lot more that we could cover. So, Ari, I'm going to start with you on this one. But I mean, is there anything that you think we haven't touched on? If somebody's trying to work on creating a story on a cruise ship, or, is there just some fun fact, something you discovered in the research, something we haven't talked about or touched on yet? Be it something about the ship, be it something about all the stuff that happens on board, things like that, or something that, we just haven't touched on.
Not really, though. I do think that recent global events did, bring up a lot of things about, I know that, there are horror writers here, yay, and that, spreading disease on a cruise ship, would be something. And that, that might be something that I visit in a future book, actually. But, I think that people who have been on cruises do kind of see them, I think, in a different way than people who haven't experienced it, because, I mean, if you know, I mean, it's literally, you have to be on there to know. Like, one of the cruises that I took pre-global issue, we actually somebody got airlifted off of the cruise ship, in the middle of the Atlantic, because she had, a life-threatening problem. It wasn't, related to that. It was a different medical issue. But getting to see things like, the Coast Guard helicopters coming and rappelling people down and then lifting the basket back up. I actually have a video on my Facebook of that. That was just, fascinating. So you never know what you're going to experience on a cruise. There's always a surprise. And that's one of the fun, parts of cruising. You never know what's going to happen.
So, Glenn, any thoughts? Anything we haven't touched on?
I like that idea about anything can happen. And I, again, this is such fertile ground for me. I've got 2 cruises scheduled next year. One to Barcelona. So, Ron, if you and your husband are interested, we're flying to Barcelona, going around the Iberian Peninsula, stopping off at Casablanca. So, I'm listening very carefully, and I'm already planning about 4 different stories here. Yeah. But I'm a rheumatologist. I'm a physician, and I just thought about I've talked to people who are ship's doctors, and every once in a while something comes up that you just can't handle on the ship, and it just kind of disrupts the whole thing. it'd be interesting to have something that really was just overwhelming, and it just took everybody, completely out of the way, and they have to go to a port of call that nobody wants to go to. And there's it verges on it sort of boils up to a mutiny, you're trying to save this one person's life, and nobody wants to go to this port where you can get help.
So, Ron, how about you? What are your thoughts? What have we not touched on tonight?
I think we've covered almost everything. One thing that did occur to me is don't forget that even if you're writing about something happening on a cruise, you've got time before the cruise and after the cruise that are still part of that vacation. Like in my first book, I actually had people who met at the hotel because they were staying at the hotel a couple of days before the cruise started. And that's a common thing to do if you're flying to Europe to start a cruise, is to go out a day or two ahead of time, see the city that you're sailing from. And that can be a major part of the story, both pre and post cruise.
Frank?
I want to give a shout out to maps, because the way I think and the way I write, I need to know how things are laid out. So I actually did find. So the other thing is the ship that I wrote about was the Lurleen, but once I realized how incompetent the crew was, I realized I needed to change the name, because I was going to keep it the same, because I was like, oh, this will be a celebration. And I was like, yeah, unless you work for Matson Lines, it's not going to be, they're not going to like this. And they still exist, and they have lawyers. So I decided to change the ship to the SS Hilo, which at the time didn't exist. But I also was able to find a room map, like the kind you get when you are on the ship, and off eBay. And I used the heck out of that, because that was amazing. But the other things I did were, and so this is like historical fiction stuff, but how did communication work? There were radiograms, and there were ship-to-shore telecommunication, which actually you could make a phone call. And I read somebody had written up how AT&T developed that. There were these big, huge, gigantic antennas on several places up and down the West Coast where you could communicate from almost Hawaii back to the mainland. It didn't sound very good. You had to yell and that sort of thing, but it was possible. But also just that kind of, for me, when I write historical fiction, I want that kind of detail to get down as granular as I can. And if I can't, then I'll smooth over it and pretend like it doesn't exist. But there was another little detail in all this, that with the Lurleen and the Matson ships in particular, when they would come into port in Honolulu, there was a tradition of, as they were coming in, people would stand on the rails and throw in silver dollars into the water. And then these kids would jump in, who were just that's what they did. They would wait for the ship to come in. It was just the Matson Lines. And they would jump into the water and get the silver dollars as the ship is going by them. By the way, they weren't just waiting until it was gone. They would jump into the water, and there's pictures. And I found somebody had taken a home movie of it. So that kind of stuff, to me, to add to the kind of local flavor of how a time, place kind of cruise would work. To me, if you're writing it, that's, like Ron said, knowing that you're going to go before and you're going to stay after, and what that's about, and how that could be as much part of the story as anything else. I think those are really critical parts to writing the story.
Marlena?
So I just wanted to kind of piggyback on the idea of anything can happen on a cruise. We had one earlier this year, and we just one of the wildest cruises we've probably been on as far as weird occasions happening. We had one dude just climbed into a pool. We had barely left the dock, and he was completely naked, just crawled in. There must have been 50 people there, kids included. Everyone was getting out of the pool. We're like, what the heck? And he just happened to be in the room next to us. So every time we walked down the hall, which, it's a long hallway, we would sit there and we'd be like, is that the guy? And he'd look at us like, oh no, everyone knows me on this ship now. Because it was a 7-day cruise. And, that kind of stuff, it's real life. Just weird stuff that happens. And you can't predict what you're gonna run into with people on a cruise. Like, it's just crazy.
JL?
Yeah, I was pretty much going to say exactly what Marlena did, which is just like, keep in mind that you've got a significant number of people crammed into a small space with nothing to do, if it's the passengers, with alcohol available, and just people are like, oh, in a general sense, like, people are nice. They're happy to be there. They're friendly. So you end up chatting with people. And then the conversations that you end up having with people can be kind of ridiculous. Like the time that I lectured like an entire pool on how the American Electoral College works, because nobody knew. And there were a bunch of Europeans and South American passengers. And we were talking about not politics specifically, but just like how politics functions. And then some international person was like, yeah, like the Electoral College, who even knows how that works? Well, I did, because I'm a nerd. And so, yeah, just the randomest things that can happen on cruise ships, because you're there. And then, 3 days later, someone's like, oh, that's the girl who knows about how the American government works. And I'm like, eh.
Tell the rest of us, we don't know.
Yeah, I usually get known as the one running around in a kilt, but that's me. Miski, what's the one thing we haven't touched on so far?
Well, Frank started it, but then he dropped it. I think it would be interesting because all cruise stories, you start at this port, you go to these ports, you turn around and you come back. He said something about being stuck in the middle between two ports. Boy, did that give me ideas, where for whatever reason, the ship has to grind to a halt and you're in the middle of the ocean. You can't see land in any direction. I'd like to see how that worked out. I think it could be interesting, without throwing somebody overboard. Maybe
Don't
killing
disappoint
them.
me now, Miski. Don't disappoint me now.
There was that one they had to tugboat up to, I think it was Louisiana a couple of years back from Mexico. That was
fished somebody out a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, there's a lot of videos you can find on that stuff.
You know what no one is talked about? No one's talked about pirates following a cruise ship. That could be fun.
Mhm.
No. No. I remember the Achille Lauro. No, pirates, no fun.
Well, one of my favorite
There must
authors
be
actually
pirates.
has written
Look
a
at
story
Ari's
about
face.
that.
There must be pirates.
We're actually going to be doing one to talk about piracy on the high seas coming somewhere next year.
Okay.
Well-
Jim, I'm giving my
Ari,
crown
I'll meet you
to Glenn.
Miski, come with us on one of these cruises. They're a blast.
Well, as captain of this ship, and I can't believe it's only been a 3-hour tour, but somehow or another, we're still making it back to port. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, and of course, what book does everybody need to get to add to that to be read pile? So, Ron, because somebody left me in charge, we're going to work backwards.
Okay. My website is rjpeterson.net. I have a reader group on Facebook under author RJ Peterson. And I've written 4 books so far. The 4th book will be out on December 20th. It's called Love in the Mediterranean.
Glenn?
Oh, okay. So it's an older story that I wrote, but I wrote it for Marvel's Tales of Wakanda, and it's called The Underside of Darkness. It's about the French and a ship that they have built, and they've stumbled onto the entry to Atlantis, and the Black Panther has to prevent World War One, a real World War One. It has some similarities to the recent movie, so I hope you pick it up and enjoy it. It's in Black Panther: Tales of Wakanda by Marvel.
Ari?
Oh, and my, I'm sorry.
Oh,
and
sorry.
my website is glennparris.com. Glenn with two N's, Paris with two R's.com.
Ari?
I can be found at arimckay.com, and I am always on Facebook, probably way more than I should be. So you can find me there as Ari McKay. You can also find my co-author, Rachel Angela, on Facebook. And our latest publication was an Ari McKay release called A Prince Among Men. And going in the exact opposite way of cruising, it takes place in the desert. So it's an action adventure with romance and a secret prince.
Miski?
Glenn, I think this has slipped me. You write for Marvel, and we need to talk. Okay. Well, see, I remember when Black Panther was a Marvel comic,
Me too.
and nobody could say the name T'Challa. But anyway, I can be found on MiskiHarris.com. I can be found on Facebook. I am that author. If it's Miski Harris, it is probably me. I don't add a lot of stuff to it to make it difficult to find me because I want you to. I am currently working on the third book in my Don't Ask, Don't Tell series. It's called Damage Control. It really touches on a lot of could be sensitive subjects because my character is military or prior military. I am also, for the first time, spearheading a collaboration called Murder Midnight at the Renaissance Elevator. A bunch of us all went to GRL this year, and there was an elevator there that I'm telling you would either give you a mastectomy or a prostatectomy. I mean, it slammed.
I just had a
So
clinch moment. Ooh.
I came up with the idea of people writing a short story occurring on the elevator. We have 32 authors, and it'll be out in September.
Very good. I like that.
Please tell me it's called Behind Closed Doors.
No, it's called Midnight in the Renaissance Elevator.
JL.
You can find me online at jlgribble.com. Facebook, Hannah JL Gribble is me, and I also spend way too much time on Facebook. I do not have my own reader group, but I spend a lot of time in a lot of other people's. Steel Magic is the first book that takes place on the cruise ship, which is part of my urban fantasy alternate history series. The spinoff that I'm working on is called Earth and Water, and will kind of same universe, different genre. And I'm having a lot of fun joining the Romance family. You guys are awesome.
Marlena?
You can find my work at marlenafrank.com. My latest release is a standalone short story. It's a sci-fi thriller with aliens, kind of mixes horror with some a little bit of dash of erotica with it. But you can find that on my website. It's available on all platforms.
And Frank?
You can find me at frankwbutterfield.com and on Facebook. The book that I was referring to today is called The Voluptuous Vixen, and it's number 9 in the Nick Williams mystery. The book that I'm working on right now, that'll be out tomorrow, hopefully, is number 15 in the Romantical Adventures of Whit and Eddie, and it's a locked room mystery also that happens during Hurricane Nicole. And it's called Rock the Boat, and it should be out hopefully tomorrow. So, and thanks again for having us.
Well, thanks to everybody for coming to hang out this evening, and thanks to everybody that's watching. I've had the pleasure of being your host and captain this evening, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the speculative-fiction-academy.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And now I get to take a breath. Ahoy, everybody.
Morning.